Men's brain versus women's brain. What AI actually found. Stanford University just published one of the most controversial neuroscience studies in decades. And there's a very good chance you never heard about it because the New York Times didn't cover it, National Public Radio didn't cover it, and the Wall Street Journal didn't cover it. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, used artificial intelligence to analyze brain scans from roughly 1,500 young adults. And what the researchers found challenges everything we've been told about male and female brains for the past 2 decades. The results were astonishing. The AI could distinguish between male and female brains with over 90% accuracy. And here's the part that makes this explosive. There wasn't a continuum. The female fingerprints of brain activity were quite different from the male fingerprints of resting brain activity, with no overlap. I'm Sergiu Popovici, and today we're breaking down what this Stanford study actually found, why it's so controversial, why mainstream media won't touch it, and what it means for understanding psychiatric disorders, cognitive differences, and human behavior. Let's start with the context that makes this study so significant. Because for years, the dominant narrative in neuroscience and psychology has been that male-female brain differences are minimal, exaggerated by stereotypes, and mostly social constructs. A recent review of MRI studies concluded that brain imaging studies exploring differences between male and female brains revealed mostly inconsistent and inconclusive findings. And many researchers argued that while there might be differences on average between male and female brains, the differences are on a continuum with lots of overlap. This became the accepted wisdom. Men's brains are about 11% larger on average, but beyond that, brains exist on a spectrum and you can't really distinguish male from female based on brain structure or function. Any differences that exist are small and unreliable. But researchers at Stanford, led by Dr. Vinod Menon, had a different hypothesis. What if previous studies simply didn't have sophisticated enough methods to detect the differences that actually exist? So they used cutting-edge deep learning artificial intelligence methods to examine brain activity in roughly 1,500 young adults aged 20 to 35. Neuroscientists have known for many years that every human brain is characterized by a fingerprint of brain activity at rest, unique to that individual. So the question was, can AI detect sex-specific patterns in these brain fingerprints that previous methods couldn't see? And the answer was yes, dramatically yes. The AI model achieved over 90% accuracy in distinguishing between male and female brains, using functional connectivity patterns. And this accuracy replicated across multiple independent datasets. To understand why this is so significant, you need to understand what they were. Measuring functional connectivity refers to how different brain regions communicate with each other, essentially the brain's wiring patterns in action. Using fMRI technology, researchers could see which brain regions were activated together during rest, forming networks of coordinated activity. And what the Stanford team discovered is that these network patterns differ fundamentally between males and females. The study used a spatiotemporal deep neural network, abbreviated SNTDNN, which directly takes fMRI time series as input and uses multiple one-dimensional convolutions of time series segments across brain regions to uncover latent circuit dynamics that distinguish between males and females. In simpler terms, the AI was looking at the dynamic patterns of how brain regions communicate over time, not just static snapshots. And it found that these dynamic patterns cluster into 2 distinct groups with essentially no overlap: male patterns and female patterns. The researchers then used explainable AI approaches to identify which specific brain features were most predictive of sex, essentially asking the AI, what are you seeing that allows you to distinguish male from female brains so accurately? And here's what they found. The hotspots that most help the model distinguish male brains from female ones include the default mode network, a brain system that helps us process self-referential information, and the striatum and limbic network, which are involved in learning and how we respond to rewards. Let's break down what each of these means, starting with the default mode network, because this is fascinating. The default mode network is the brain system that activates when you're not focused on the external world. When you're daydreaming, thinking about yourself, considering your past and future, engaging in social cognition about other people's mental states. Research shows that this network is organized differently in male and female brains, which might explain documented differences in self-referential processing, social cognition, and how the sexes process emotional information about themselves. The striatum and limbic network differences are equally significant because these systems are central to motivation, reward processing, emotional regulation, and learning from reinforcement. Other research has found that interhemispheric connectivity, how the left and right brain hemispheres communicate, is particularly important for predicting sex from brain imaging, achieving 88% classification accuracy using emotion task data. In particular, females were shown to have higher local functional connectivity density, meaning more interconnected communication within local brain regions, while males showed different patterns of long-range connectivity between distant brain regions. Now here's where this gets controversial and why mainstream media largely ignored this. study, the researchers directly challenged the prevailing narrative that brain sex differences are minimal or exist on a continuum. They wrote, "Our results provide the most compelling and generalizable evidence to date, refuting this continuum hypothesis and firmly demonstrating sex differences in the functional organization of the human brain." This is a direct rebuttal to years of research claiming that male-female brain differences are too small to matter or are primarily social constructs, and the Stanford team attributes the failure of previous work to demonstrate these effects to the weaker algorithms employed in earlier research. In other words, the differences were always there. Previous methods just weren't sophisticated enough to detect them reliably. But once you use state-of-the-art AI that can detect subtle patterns in high-dimensional data, the differences become undeniable and highly replicable. And replicability is crucial here because psychology and neuroscience have been dealing with a reproducibility crisis where many published findings fail to replicate in new samples. The Stanford team specifically addressed this by testing their AI model on multiple independent data sets. They trained it on one group of brains, then tested whether it could accurately classify completely different people's brains, and it could, consistently, across multiple replications. They also tested whether the model trained on young adults could classify adolescent brains. And again it worked, suggesting these sex differences in brain organization emerge early and remain stable. Now, I want to address something critical before we go further. Finding brain differences between males and females does not mean one is better or worse. It means they're organized differently on average, and understanding these differences has profound implications for mental health. A key motivation for this study is that sex plays a crucial role in human brain development, in aging, and in the manifestation of psychiatric and neurological disorders. Identifying consistent and replicable sex differences in the healthy adult brain is a critical step toward a deeper understanding of sex-specific vulnerabilities in psychiatric and neurological disorders, and the sex differences in psychiatric disorders. Our massive and undeniable autism spectrum disorder has a roughly 4-to-1 male-to-female ratio. Depression has about a 2-to-1 female-to-male ratio. ADHD is more common in males. Anxiety disorders are more common in females. Schizophrenia manifests differently in males and females, with different symptom profiles and ages of onset. For decades we've known these differences exist, but haven't understood why. And one hypothesis is that if male and female brains are organized differently at a fundamental level, this might explain differential vulnerability to disorders that affect specific brain systems. For example, if the default mode network, which is involved in self-referential processing and rumination, is organized differently in female brains, this might contribute to higher rates of depression in women, where rumination is a key maintaining factor. If the striatum and reward systems are organized differently in male brains, this might contribute to higher rates of disorders involving motivation and reward processing like ADHD and autism. Understanding these brain-based differences doesn't mean giving up on behavioral or social interventions. It means having a more complete picture that allows for more targeted, effective, potentially sex-specific treatments. Now let's talk about why this study received so little mainstream media coverage, because that's revealing in itself. One prominent psychologist noted, "I suspect that's because most mainstream media are cautious of anything having to do with brain-based differences between women and men." And he's probably right. For the past 20 years, the dominant cultural narrative has been that gender differences are primarily or entirely social constructs, that biological differences beyond the obvious reproductive ones are minimal, exaggerated, or don't exist. This narrative served important purposes. It challenged sexist assumptions about women's intellectual capabilities. It opened opportunities that had been unfairly closed. It questioned stereotypes that limited both men and women. But like many corrective narratives, it may have overcorrected, creating an environment where acknowledging any biological differences became politically suspect, even when the science clearly showed those differences existed. The Stanford study represents extremely rigorous science published in one of the world's most prestigious journals. Using the largest datasets available, employing cutting-edge methodology, replicating across multiple samples, conducted by researchers at one of the world's top universities. But it challenges a narrative that has become culturally dominant, and so it gets ignored. Because acknowledging these findings requires nuanced thinking that our current discourse doesn't handle well. We need to be able to say, male and female brains show significant organizational differences, on average. And these differences don't make one sex superior or inferior. They're just different. And understanding these differences helps us understand vulnerability to disorders and potentially develop better treatments. And none of this justifies discrimination or limits what individuals can achieve regardless of their sex. But our media environment struggles with that level of nuance. It's easier to ignore findings that don't fit clean narratives, even when those findings come from rigorous science. Now I want to be clear about what this research does and doesn't show, because precision matters here. This research shows that functional brain organization, the patterns of connectivity between brain regions, differ significantly and reliably between males and females on average. It does not show that all male brains are identical to each other and different from all female brains. Individual variation within each sex is still substantial. It does not show that these differences are entirely genetic and unchangeable. Brain organization is shaped by both biology and experience throughout development. It does not show that observed behavioral or cognitive differences between men and women are entirely explained by brain organization. Behavior emerges from complex interactions between brain, body, environment, and culture. And it certainly doesn't show that stereotypes about male and female capabilities are accurate. Population-level average differences tell you nothing about any individual person's abilities. What it does show is that when we're trying to understand why psychiatric disorders manifest differently in males and females, or why certain cognitive tasks show sex differences, or how the brain develops and ages, we need to account for sex as a biological variable because it matters at a fundamental level of brain organization. The researchers are careful to note that their findings have important implications. If we develop treatments for brain-based disorders without considering that male and female brains are organized differently, we might be developing treatments that work better for one sex than the other without realizing it. Clinical trials that don't analyze results separately by sex might miss sex-specific effects. Diagnostic criteria based primarily on male presentation of disorders might miss or misdiagnose females with the same conditions. And understanding typical sex differences might help us identify atypical development earlier. And there's fascinating work showing that these brain organization differences relate to actual behavior. The Stanford study found that the sex-specific brain features they identified were predictive of cognitive profiles, meaning the brain differences aren't just random. They correspond to differences in how people actually think and behave. Research using task-based fMRI, where people perform cognitive tasks while being scanned, found that they could predict male versus female with 88% accuracy, and importantly, interhemispheric connectivity. How the two brain hemispheres communicate was most predictive of sex. This matches other research finding that females show higher local connectivity within brain regions while males show different patterns of connectivity between distant regions, which might relate to documented differences in how the sexes approach problem solving and information integration. None of this means that men can't have female typical brain organization patterns, or vice versa. Individual variation exists, but it does mean that sex is a meaningful biological variable when studying the brain, not a social construct that we can ignore in neuroscience research. The controversy around this research reflects a larger tension in science and society. How do we acknowledge biological differences without those differences being weaponized to justify discrimination? How do we study sex differences rigorously while ensuring the research isn't misused to support sexist stereotypes? How do we maintain scientific integrity while being sensitive to social implications? These are legitimate concerns, but the answer can't be to ignore rigorous scientific findings because they're uncomfortable or might be misused. The answer has to be better science communication that explains what findings mean and don't mean, and a more nuanced public discourse that can hold multiple truths simultaneously. Male and female brains show significant organizational differences on average, and individuals should be judged on their own capabilities, not stereotypes about their sex. And understanding brain differences might improve mental health treatment, and none of this justifies discrimination in any domain of life. If you found this breakdown of controversial neuroscience valuable, subscribe to Psychology by Sergiu Popovici, and hit the notification bell for more research-backed content that doesn't shy away from complex findings. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this research. Do you think mainstream media should have covered it? Why do you think they didn't? And what do you make of the findings themselves? These discussions matter because science should be discussed openly, especially when findings challenge prevailing narratives. Thank you for watching, and remember, good science reveals reality, even when reality is more complex than our narratives suggest. I'll see you in the next one.